Something inside you has already begun to die, and that's not a pretty metaphor. It's a psychological fact. When this process begins, there is no warning, no dramatic fall, no visible collapse. The world remains too functional to justify the discomfort that grows inside. You continue waking up, working, talking, answering messages, but at some almost imperceptible point, meaning slips through your fingers. And when meaning is lost, nothing holds up in the same way anymore. Carl Jung described this moment as a shift in the center of the psyche. It's not life that enters a crisis. It's the internal axis that ceases to coincide with the character you've learned to be. The persona, that carefully constructed identity designed to fit, please, and function, begins to fail. Not because you made a mistake, but because it has fulfilled all it could fulfill. And now, something deeper demands to be expressed. Perhaps you felt this as an inexplicable weariness, a discomfort without a name, a strange sensation of living a life that, while correct, no longer feels real. You ask yourself, what's happening to me? And this question is not accidental. It arises when the unconscious begins to pressure the ego, when what has been repressed for years begins to demand recognition. Jung claimed that no one awakens without paying a price. Awakening doesn't come as a gentle light, but as a fracture. First, something becomes unbearable. Certain conversations, certain environments, certain relationships. Automatic laughter loses its power. Trained enthusiasm sounds false. The body responds before the mind, with tension, apathy, or an inner silence that bothers more than any explicit pain. And you try to rationalize. You look for an external reason, an event, someone to blame, but you find none. What if there is no one to blame? What if the discomfort isn't a mistake but a calling? This is the frightening part, because if there's no one to blame, then perhaps there's no simple return to the previous state. Perhaps what's happening isn't a deviation, but a natural process of psychic growth. Jung called this individuation, the slow and inevitable movement of consciousness towards its own wholeness. A movement that almost always begins when the life you've built ceases to encompass who you are becoming. Notice, nothing needs to have gone wrong for everything to start crumbling from within. Sometimes, what collapses isn't the external structure, but the internal justification for continuing within it. And this generates a tension that's difficult to explain to others. How can you say that something no longer works when in everyone's eyes it seems to function perfectly? How can you sustain this discomfort without seeming ungrateful, confused, or unstable? This is where many back down, not because they don't feel the call, but because it threatens everything that has been carefully organized. Jung warned, the unconscious does not negotiate with social conventions. When the self begins to manifest itself, it doesn't ask permission from reputation, routine, or the expectations of others. It simply presses repeatedly until it is heard. Ignoring it doesn't make it disappear. It only makes it more intense. You can try to distract yourself. You can keep yourself busy, fill the time, numb the silence. You can even convince yourself that it's just a phase, but something keeps nagging inside, like a wordless question. And perhaps the question is this: who you became to survive. Are you still who you need to be to live? This initial phase is marked by a strange feeling of estrangement from oneself. You observe yourself from the outside, as if you were playing a role you know well, but which no longer feels like your own. Jung said that this is the moment when the ego begins to realize that it is not the center of the psyche, only a temporary administrator. And few shocks are as profound as this one. There is also fear, not the immediate, dramatic fear, but a diffuse, almost intellectual fear. The fear of changing without knowing where to. The fear of losing ties, status, identity. The fear of discovering that upon peeling back the layers, there is nothing solid underneath. But what if there is? What if what you fear finding is exactly what was silenced so that you would fit in? In the symbolic tradition that runs through both Jung and theosophical thought, this moment is seen as a threshold, a point of transition between a life guided by external adaptations and another guided by a deeper inner principle. It is not a comfortable stage. It is unstable territory, where old certainties dissolve before new ones can form. You may feel the urge to withdraw, to reduce contact, to seek silence, not out of rejection of others, but out of an urgent need to hear something that has always been suppressed. And this often generates conflicts, both internal and external, because the world expects constancy, while the psyche demands transformation. And these two forces rarely walk hand in hand at the beginning of the process. Perhaps you still can't explain what's happening. Perhaps you only know that something has ended, even if it hasn't officially ended. Jung would say that this is the clearest sign that the unconscious has taken the lead, and when that happens, resistance may maintain the appearance of stability, but it deepens the internal rupture. This first phase doesn't bring answers. It brings discomfort, questions, and the unsettling feeling that it's no longer possible to live on autopilot. It's a silent beginning, almost invisible to those looking from the outside, but absolutely decisive for those who go through it. Because from this point on, something has already been displaced, and what has been displaced doesn't return to its original place without too high a cost. If you've made it this far, you probably already know. It's not about fixing your life. It's about recognizing that an essential part of you is asking to be heard. And ignoring that request doesn't make you weaker. It just keeps you divided. What comes next is neither immediate nor simple. Before any reconstruction, something still needs to be confronted. Something that until now has remained on the sidelines, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And this encounter will inevitably change the way you see yourself and how you see the world. You begin to notice the change not in big decisions, but in small daily frictions. Invitations you once accepted without thinking now weigh heavily. Simple messages take longer to be answered. Conversations that always flowed smoothly begin to sound repetitive, predictable, empty, and then a new discomfort arises. The feeling that you are disappointing someone simply because you can no longer be the same as before. It is at this point that guilt enters the scene, silent and efficient, disguised as responsibility, empathy, and good character. Carl Jung observed that guilt rarely stems from a real moral failing. Most often, it arises when the persona begins to unravel. The persona is that set of roles you've learned to play in order to be accepted. The available friend, the understanding partner, the reliable professional, the person who can endure anything. For a long time, this mask worked. It gave you a place, recognition, belonging. But now, when the inner axis begins to shift, maintaining this structure requires an effort that the body and mind can no longer sustain. You feel it in everyday situations. You're at a family gathering and suddenly realize you're only physically present. Someone tells a story, everyone laughs, and you join in the laughter with a delay, as if you were watching yourself from the outside. Or you're with friends, listening to problems you've always heard, offering advice you've always offered, and something inside you shuts down. It's not a lack of affection, it's exhaustion. An exhaustion that doesn't come from too many tasks, but from too much adaptation. Even so, the mind insists on accusing itself. You've changed. You're drifting away. You're not the same person anymore. And these phrases hurt because, in part, they are true. But the pain doesn't come from the change itself. It comes from the idea that change is wrong. Jung said that the ego prefers known repetition to unknown truth. And guilt is one of the most effective mechanisms for keeping this repetition active. Perhaps you've already experienced this situation. You decide to say no to something simple, something you would normally do automatically. It could be a favor, a date, a long conversation on a day when all you need is silence. The no comes out hesitantly, almost like an apology, and the other person's response, even if subtle, triggers something inside you. A different tone, an awkward silence, a snide comment. Nothing explicit, but enough for guilt to set in. And you start to wonder if you overreacted, if you were too harsh, if you should have given in. This is the point where Jung would ask an uncomfortable question. Are you feeling guilty for having hurt someone, or for not having fulfilled the role that was expected of you? These are very different things, but they are often confused. Guilt linked to the persona does not arise from real harm, but from the breaking of an implicit agreement, the agreement to remain predictable, available, malleable. In everyday life, this manifests as a constant feeling of emotional debt. You feel obligated to be present, to give quick answers, attention, explanations, as if the simple fact of needing space required a formal justification. And the more you try to explain yourself, the more tired you become. Because ultimately there is no logical explanation that satisfies those who depend on your continued presence in that role. Jung observed that, at this stage, many people retreat. Not because they don't feel the need for change, but because they fear the emptiness that may arise if they cease to be needed. Being needed gives identity. It gives function. It gives a specific kind of value. Giving that up is risky because it forces you to confront a question that is rarely asked aloud. Who am I when I'm not supporting anyone? There's also an element of mystery in this phase, something difficult to name. You begin to realize that some relationships only worked because you bent over backwards, that some bonds depended on your constant effort to stay alive. This realization doesn't come as an accusation, but as clarity. And clarity sometimes hurts more than open conflict, because it leaves no room for comfortable illusions. You can try to go back. You can strive to be like you were before, respond faster, accept more invitations, smile more, and for a while, that even works. But something has already been seen, and what has been seen cannot be unseen. The tiredness returns faster. The emptiness intensifies. The feeling of betraying yourself becomes more evident. Jung would say that, from that point on, the unconscious no longer accepts being pushed to the bottom without reacting. It's common then for a strange internal conflict to arise. On one hand, the desire to preserve bonds. On the other, an almost physical need to distance oneself. You don't want to hurt anyone, but you also can't continue hurting yourself in silence. And this tension manifests in the body. Tightness in the chest, irritation without a clear reason, difficulty relaxing even during moments of rest. The body perceives what the mind is still trying to negotiate. Perhaps you'll start to notice that some people react badly to your change, even if you haven't done anything concrete. They sense it. They sense that you're no longer as available, as predictable, as easy to reach. And this creates unease, sometimes resistance. Not because you've become worse, but because you've stopped fulfilling a role that was comfortable for them. Here a silent turning point occurs. You begin to suspect that the guilt you carry is not a sign of error, but a sign of transition, that perhaps this discomfort is not something to be eliminated quickly, but to be traversed with attention. Jung saw this moment as the real beginning of the individuation process, when the individual must choose between maintaining external adaptation at any cost, or risking greater fidelity to their own internal experience. None of this is resolved all at once. There are no definitive decisions yet. There's only a growing perception that something no longer fits, that continuing as before demands too high a price. And even without knowing exactly what will come next, you begin to understand that you can no longer ignore this sign without consequences. What remains unclear is what happens when you stop maintaining the persona. What emerges when the role begins to fall away? There's something there, waiting but still shrouded in shadow, and this inevitable encounter will be the next step in this journey. When detachment ceases to be merely an external gesture and begins to produce inner silence, something different happens. It's not peace yet. It's a kind of suspension, as if the world had lowered its volume. But you still didn't know what to do with the sound of your own mind. Distractions lose their power. Automatic habits no longer numb you, and what was previously hidden by routine begins to emerge with an uncomfortable clarity. Jung called this moment an encounter with the shadow, but not in the simplistic sense of the bad side. The shadow is everything that was pushed out of consciousness because it didn't fit the image you needed to maintain. You begin to notice thoughts you've always avoided, emotions you deemed inappropriate, an old anger, an unresolved resentment, a desire to distance yourself that has been denied so many times that it has become chronic fatigue. None of this emerges in an organized way. It comes in fragments, in sensations, in impulses that you don't immediately recognize. And the most disturbing thing is not the content itself, but the fact that it has always been there, waiting for an opening. The more the persona weakens, the less the shadow needs to scream to be perceived. Have you ever wondered how many decisions in your life were made to avoid conflict, not out of genuine conviction? Have you noticed how many of your virtues were born from the fear of losing connections? When the shadow begins to reveal itself, these questions cease to be abstract and gain emotional weight. They don't seek immediate answers. They simply remain there, occupying space, preventing you from returning to your previous state of comfortable unconsciousness. The emptiness that settles in at this stage is often misinterpreted. It's not an absence of meaning, but an absence of distraction. Before, external noise filled everything. Now, silence creates a space where what was denied can finally appear. That's why so many people retreat at this point. Not because the emptiness is unbearable, but because it demands honesty. And honesty, when not practiced with oneself, is more frightening than any external loss. Daily life takes on a different weight. Simple walks become longer than expected. Moments of pause gain a strange density. You find yourself thinking about past situations, not with nostalgia, but with a clarity that didn't exist before. You begin to notice patterns, how you always took on responsibilities that weren't yours, how you avoided saying no, how you confused affection with permanence. These perceptions don't come as moral judgment, but as cold observation. And that changes everything. What do you do when you realize that part of your identity was built to survive, not to live? What happens when you understand that much of what you called love was, in fact, fear of being abandoned? These questions don't demand quick answers. They are unsettling because they point to something that can no longer be ignored: the need to reorganize your own relationship with yourself. Jung asserted that the unintegrated shadow always governs life from the unconscious. While you believe you are only what you show, what you hide begins to direct your choices. It is at this point that emptiness transforms into a portal. It doesn't want to destroy you, it wants to reveal you. But revelation requires that you remain in discomfort long enough to understand what is being shown, without rushing to fix, explain, or soften it. There's a specific moment in this phase when the silence starts to bother you less and the restlessness changes form. You realize you're not exactly sad, but you're not satisfied either. It's as if you're caught between versions of yourself. The old one no longer works, the new one hasn't yet emerged. This interval generates anxiety because the mind prefers clear definitions. But this interval is necessary. Without it, any attempt at change would only be a superficial variation of the same pattern.
Have you ever noticed how the rush to feel good again often pushes people back into the same cycles? Have you realized how the need for quick relief can prevent real transformation? Remaining in this intermediate state requires something rare: tolerance for uncertainty. And this tolerance isn't learned externally. It's built through the direct experience of emptiness. As you accept not to immediately fill that space, something subtle begins to happen.
The shadow ceases to be merely a threat and starts to offer information. You better understand your limits, your impulses, your real needs. Not because someone explained it, but because you observed. And observing without reacting is a profoundly transformative gesture. It is here that the process ceases to be merely painful and begins to become revealing. Still, nothing is resolved. The shadow doesn't integrate all at once. The void doesn't close quickly. What exists now is a greater awareness than before, and a growing impossibility of returning to unconsciousness. You've seen too much, felt too much, understood too much, and this creates a new tension: to continue moving forward or to try to restore the old artificial balance. Are you willing to discover who you are without the masks that have kept you safe until now? Are you prepared to sustain your own company without the old external support? These questions don't require heroic courage, just continuous honesty, because the next step in this journey won't be comfortable, but it will be decisive. Something will need to be left behind more consciously. And this gesture, simple on the outside and profound on the inside, will mark an irreversible change in how you relate to the world and to yourself. At some point in this process, something changes in quality. It's no longer just introspection or discomfort. A silent, almost imperceptible but irreversible decision emerges. You begin to remove energy. It doesn't announce, it doesn't dramatize, it doesn't make lists. It simply stops insisting. It stops over-explaining. It stops sustaining what only survives through its constant effort. This movement seems small, but it has a profound impact because it breaks a pattern that may have guided much of its life. Carl Jung observed that the human psyche functions like an economic system. Where energy goes, something grows. Where energy is withdrawn, something inevitably transforms or dies. And that's exactly what's starting to happen now. You don't need to abruptly cut ties for them to change. You just need to stop automatically feeding them. You just need to stop reacting impulsively. You just need to stop adapting before being asked. And curiously, it is at this point that unexpected reactions arise. Some people find it strange. Others get closer as if they sense the imminent loss of access. There are those who try to recapture old versions of you with subtle phrases. You're not the same anymore. I feel you're distant. What happened? And perhaps nothing has happened in the external sense. What changed was internal. Jung would say that the ego begins to lose exclusive control when the self takes over the regulation of psychic energy, and this alters the entire dynamic of relationships. There are curious accounts of this stage. People who, by reducing their contact with certain environments, begin to sleep better without knowing why. Others report that anxiety decreases even before any major conscious decision. Some notice changes in their bodies: deeper breathing, reduced muscle tension, less irritability. Not because life has become easier, but because the mind has stopped sustaining conflicts that were not recognized as such. You start to notice something strange. Many relationships only existed as long as you were making an effort, as long as you were initiating conversation, maintaining the atmosphere. resolving misunderstandings, anticipating needs. When this effort ceases, the bond enters a state of suspension. Some dissolve quickly, others become unstable, oscillating between closeness and distance. This may be surprising because it dismantles an old belief that certain connections were solid in themselves. Reality shows that in many cases they were sustained by habit and convenience. There's a curious finding observed in studies on social behavior and mental health. People who learn to establish clear boundaries, even facing initial discomfort, show a significant reduction in chronic stress over time. Jung didn't work with modern statistics, but he understood the principle behind this. The psyche becomes ill when it needs to sustain contradictions for too long. Saying yes when everything inside you screams no creates an internal fissure that gradually takes its toll. At this point, something unexpected happens. The space that previously seemed empty begins to organize itself differently. It doesn't immediately appear filled with new people or intense experiences. It appears cleaner, quieter, and this silence ceases to be threatening. You realize you can get through an entire day without needing to prove yourself, justify yourself, or adapt excessively. And this realization changes your perception of value. Jung argued that true transformation doesn't occur when you acquire something new, but when you stop depending on what is not essential. Letting go in this sense is not abandonment, it's reorganization. It's freeing the psyche from unconscious agreements that no longer make sense. And this has a powerful side effect. Your attention becomes more selective. You quickly begin to perceive when a situation requires you to diminish yourself to fit in. Daily life offers small tests. A conversation that once drained you now sounds clearly empty. An invitation that once seemed obligatory now reveals its emotional cost. And you begin to choose differently, sometimes without explaining, sometimes without realizing you've chosen. These micro-decisions build a new pattern of presence. It's not isolation, it's coherence. There are also unlikely encounters at this stage, people who appear effortlessly, with whom conversation flows without tension, relationships that don't demand performance. They aren't necessarily deep bonds yet, but they carry a different quality, lightness. Jung would see this as a sign of internal alignment. When energy isn't dispersed in unrecognized conflicts, it organizes itself more precisely. But not everything is peaceful. The ego, accustomed to controlling the environment through adaptation, feels the loss of power, and it tries to reclaim its territory with familiar strategies. Nostalgia arises strongly. The temptation to return to the old pattern appears disguised as longing, compassion, responsibility. You find yourself wondering if you haven't overdone it, if you couldn't try a little harder, if you shouldn't be more understanding. This is where the narrative takes a subtle turn. You realize you've tried more than enough, that returning wouldn't bring anything new, only repetition. Jung said that repeating patterns expecting different results is a sign that consciousness hasn't yet integrated the previous experience. But when repetition becomes visible, it loses its power of seduction. Silence now acts as a filter. What remains within it is what has substance. What disappears without fanfare, and you begin to understand something essential. It's not your job to keep everything alive. Some things only exist as long as you artificially sustain them. Removing that support isn't cruelty, it's respect for reality. This phase brings no celebration. There is no feeling of victory. There is a sober clarity, a calm understanding that life begins to reorganize itself when you stop fighting against your own internal movement. And although there is still uncertainty about what will come next, something has already been firmly established. You are no longer willing to compromise your integrity to preserve appearances. What lies ahead is a deeper choice, not just about who stays, but about how you relate to the world from this new center. And this choice will require something that has been carefully avoided until now. Fully accepting the consequences of being true to yourself. There comes a point when you realize you're no longer at war with yourself, not because everything has been resolved, not because life has become perfect, but because something fundamental has aligned. You begin to live from a more stable, less reactive center. Decisions no longer stem from the fear of losing, but from the clarity of choice. And that changes everything. It changes how you wake up, how you respond, how you position yourself, how you withdraw when necessary. There's no longer a rush to explain who you are because you finally know. Perhaps the greatest transformation is silent. You begin to perceive your limits before exceeding them. You feel your body warn you when something is wrong. You notice emotional fatigue before it turns into burnout. This inner listening, which previously seemed impossible amidst the external noise, now becomes a daily practice, and it is here that everything begins to become applicable, real, concrete, not as a beautiful concept, but as a way of life. Applying everything you've experienced so far doesn't require grand gestures. It requires small, consistent choices. It requires, for example, pausing before responding automatically, asking yourself honestly, do I want this, or am I just avoiding discomfort? It requires carefully observing which relationships strengthen you and which only drain your energy. It requires the courage to maintain silence when before you filled everything with words for fear of being misunderstood. You begin to understand that self-care isn't isolation, it's discernment. That saying no isn't rejection, it's direction. That distancing yourself doesn't mean lack of love, but emotional maturity. Practical life transforms when you stop always putting yourself second. When you respect your own signals, the world begins to reorganize itself around you, even if it takes time. Some people get closer, others distance themselves, and that's okay. Not everything is meant to last. There is also a profound shift in how you deal with solitude. It ceases to be an enemy and becomes a tool, a space for recalibration, a territory where you reconnect with yourself before connecting with others. Being alone is no longer synonymous with abandonment, but with presence. And this presence changes the quality of everything you touch. Conversations become more genuine. Encounters are rarer yet more meaningful. Time is used more consciously. In practice, this means choosing better where to invest your attention. It means reducing commitments that don't make sense. It means creating simple routines that support your mental health. Moments of silence, writing, walking, reflection. Not as an obligation, but as a way to maintain inner balance. You begin to realize that you don't need to be constantly available to be valuable. Your existence doesn't depend on the constant approval of others. And when doubts arise because they do, you no longer panic. You've learned that the process isn't linear. There are days of strength and days of nostalgia. There are moments of clarity and others of confusion. The difference is that now you don't interpret this as failure. You understand that it's part of the natural movement of growth. And above all, you know that you don't need to return to internal places that have already hurt you just to alleviate momentary discomfort. The path that opens before you doesn't promise an absence of pain, but it offers something more valuable: coherence. A life where your actions don't contradict your feelings, where your choices don't distance you from yourself, where you can look in the mirror and recognize the person who is there, without the constant feeling of living a borrowed life. Perhaps the greatest invitation from this closing is simple and direct. Take this into your daily life. Observe yourself. Respect your signals. Honor your limits. Don't wait to have all the answers to start acting in a way that's more aligned with who you are today. Start small. A no said at the right moment. A silence respected. A conscious choice. That's how transformation takes hold. If you've made it this far, it wasn't by chance. Something along this journey spoke directly to you. And that's already a sign of movement. If you feel like it, like this video. Leave a comment, even anonymously, sharing a word, a feeling, something that represents the moment you're living right now. Your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to read. And if this content resonated with you, subscribe to the channel. Here, the goal is to continue walking together, with honesty, depth, and respect for everyone's process. True transformation doesn't happen all at once. It's built in everyday life, in subtle choices, in silent fidelity to oneself. And now, with everything you've seen and felt so far, the next step no longer depends on more theory. It depends only on you.